From the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, it's Retro Nerd Girl with a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the movie Conan the Barbarian, released in 1982. The synopsis is: the tragic life of an orphan leads him to become an invincible gladiator and eventually a free man. His adventures lead him down the path of his parents' killer, the savage warlord Thulsa Doom. The story: the character of Conan was created by American author Robert Irvin Howard in 1932 in American fantasy horror pulp fiction magazine Weird Tales. Conan's predecessor Kull was invented from Robert's first sword and sorcery story, released in 1927 in The Shadow Kingdom. He wrote many stories for Kull, but after having his Kull story, By This Axe I Rule, rejected, Howard sought to write other characters. In 1931, he introduced the character of Conan of the Reavers in the story People of the Dark. A year later, Robert rewrote the story, By This Axe I Rule, replacing Kull for Conan. In The Phoenix on the Sword, which takes place in Howard's imaginary Hyborian age. Howard tragically committed suicide after learning that his mother was in a coma with no hopes of recovery. His estate was left to his father and changed hands until 1953, when his works were first published as a hardcover collection. The Coming of Conan was published in 1953, Conan the Barbarian in 1954, The Sword of Conan in 1952, King Conan in 1953, and Conan the Conqueror, aka The Hour of the Dragon, in 1950. Conan's legend continued with other writers at the helm. These books had exciting covers illustrated by Frank Frazetta, which enhanced the popularity of these books. Then in 1970, Marvel turned Conan into a comic book series. The executive producer, Edward R. Pressman, began collaborating with associate producer Edward Summer as early as 1970, but really made more of an aggressive effort in 1975. Summer thought of franchising Conan in a 6-film series and co-wrote a screenplay with Roy Thomas. It took 2 years to get the film rights, and in the meantime they were bouncing around prospects for who would play Conan. After seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger's charismatic performance in the rough cut of his bodybuilding film Pumping Iron in 1977, he was hired for the role immediately. At about the same time, Oliver Stone was brought in to write the script, with the possibility of directing it along with Joe Alves. His script was going to be a 4-hour saga set in a post-apocalyptic future in a battle against a horde of 10,000 mutants, taking inspiration from Black Colossus, released in 1933, and A Witch Shall Be Born in 1934. The film would have been too expensive for filmmakers at about $70 million to make, so Oliver Stone was out of there. At one point, Oliver then asked Ridley Scott to direct in 1979, who declined. Edward Pressman sold the project to Dino De Laurentiis, and Dino's daughter, Raffaella, produced the film. John Milius was hired to direct, and he rewrote Stone's script to set the story in the Hyborian age and added more scenes from Howard's stories and influences from swordplay movies like Seven Samurai in 1954. The rewrite also slashed the budget in half. What we got is one of my favorite sword and sorcery movies ever. It's quite violent because of the nature of the character and the savagery of this age. So I am warning you that I will be talking about some pretty vile events that happen in the film. The dialogue is done with simplicity and at times inserting life lessons in this poignant prose, reminiscent of the source material. There's something very ancient and authentic about the dialogue and narration. I thought that this was an excellent story with lots of adventure, while not one character was wasted. The film has some strong philosophical messages that will take me some time to get through all of it, so please bear with me. If you enjoy diving deep into these story elements and themes, let me tell you of the days of high adventure. The pacing at 2 hours and 9 minutes, it's a little long, but I never felt the time because I was so engrossed in the story. I thought the slower parts of the story were so vital to fully drink in Conan's challenge, motivation, and philosophy. Every frame means something, and I enjoy watching every second of it, even the gory parts, and I'm not that much into gore. Now the challenge. Oh, this is my favorite part. The challenge in the film is the leader of Vanir raiders by the name of Thulsa Doom. According to Norse mythology, the Vanir were gods of fertility, wisdom, and the ability to see the future. The origin of the character of Thulsa Doom was an Atlantean necromancer created in 1928, which predates the creation of the character of Conan. Sadly, the segment he was to appear in was rejected by Weird Tales, but he was later featured in King Kull, published by Lancer's Books in 1967. There he was portrayed as having the face of a skull with eye sockets of fire. How cool is that? Perhaps he was the inspiration for one of my favorite characters, Skeletor of the Masters of the Universe. Rumor has it that He-Man was a character that was modeled after Conan and was originally a nameless Barbarian toy. So there is a possibility. I'm, not claiming to know anything, but I'm seeing similarities. Now, in this film, Thulsa was changed to be sort of a version of Conan's villain from the books, Thoth and Mon, who was a servant of the serpent god Set. And as confirmation that this is exactly who he's inspired by, there's a line in the film where Thulsa utters that he worships the snake god Set. As well, there are snakes and snake motifs all throughout the film to represent this sect. In the beginning of the film, it shows Vanir raiders storm Conan's village, killing all of the adults, enslaving the children, and burning the location to the ground. Conan's father's sword is somehow valuable to them, so it could have been a raid to acquire weapons since they were after the riddle of steel. Now, they made off with slaves and whatever valuables they could find there. And these are all very valuable things in the Hyborian age. However, later on, Thulsa doesn't even remember why he attacked the village. It could have been due to some kind of revenge or offense, which seems to be possible, as at the end of the scene, we can see that there are heads of villagers, including Conan's parents, that are posted on pegs as perhaps a warning to other tribes. I'm really reading into a lot of this, but there's just so much detail here to go through, and I love it. Thulsa Doom is no ordinary man. He can straighten out snakes and use them as arrows, and that takes a special kind of talent, I would say, of the magical kind. In the beginning of the film, he's introduced by facing off with Conan's mother, who is determined to fight him before she'll give up her son. He has a moment with her where he looks into her eyes and hypnotizes her for a moment, just enough for him to have the upper hand and act swiftly. About 20 years later, Thulsa's power seemed to have grown to the point that he has changed his focus from gaining steel and wealth to becoming a spiritual leader. He says that real power is the power to be able to control people that follow him. The power of the flesh is what he calls it. And it's not certain whether or not Thulsa was inspired by anyone in particular, but the world was still in shock over the mass murder-suicides that left 909 dead and 304 of them children by cult members led by Jim Jones on November 18th, 1978. this could be the inspiration for this character. Someone like this is very dangerous, much more dangerous and more realistic of an enemy. Now, there are shadows of that kind of human mind control as he commands a young girl to come to him from a cliff. Instead of walking down the side of the cliff, she takes the shortest route and just jumps to him, falling to her death as if in a trance. His powers have come a long way from his interaction with Conan's mother. He has been convincing many young people, princes and princesses, to follow his snake cult, and through the process they are ready to abandon and even kill their parents. One such character is the daughter of King Osric of Shadizar, Princess Jasmina. The king explains that his daughter has left home to find her soul with Thulsa. Thulsa uses sex and cannibalistic rituals to gain greater magical powers, as many of the people who follow him are sacrificed as food in his rituals. At one point in Thulsa Doom's kitchen in the Mountain of Power, there is a gruesome scene of dead bodies being prepared for a nasty, putrid green soup. It is a tough scene to get through, and it also shows us one of his insane followers that is so zombified that she chews on a hand that comes from the soup. And this soup is filled with many, many body parts of their victims. Ugh, yuck. Somehow, I do believe that these sacrifices, these human sacrifices, are enhancing his magical abilities. This is all theory. This is all part of my theory about Thulsa Doom. It doesn't make it fact, but it is in the interwoven themes of this story, dealing with magic and sacrifice. Now, one of the many things about his abilities is that he can live for a very long time. Tales have it that he's over 1,000 years old, and there's a theory that he is immortal. In the film, Conan is able to kill him, but there are theories that the character's actual skull can live on. This takes us back to the original rendition of the character having a skull for a face, and I thought that was fascinating. And that's not all. Thulsa can also transform into a giant snake. That part is the most incredible that I have ever seen. It is very cool. And it could be a display of the god Set rewarding him with more powers for his loyalties and human sacrifice. He is also very upset when Conan kills one of his pet giant snakes. I mention that because this is also connected to his snake god. He is accompanied by two impressive henchmen that are prominent during the destruction of Conan's village, Rexor and Thorgrim. They display no magical abilities but act as high-ranking priests and soldiers. I think that they are no ordinary henchmen in relation to Thulsa Doom. The three share a distinctive look and the same hair design, signaling some kind of brotherhood, either by religion, tribe, or blood. I've always imagined that they were brothers, like Thulsa being the older half-brother. When the two characters failed to kill Conan at the ritual temple, Thulsa doesn't reprimand them, as other villains would typically do to their henchmen. However, they stand in unity. There's a deep brotherly bond between them. Seeing the three together is a great visual, and you get the sense that there's more tied between them than just camaraderie. When Rexor and Thorgrim are ultimately killed, he gives a very impassioned speech to urge his followers to commit mass murder against non-believers to inherit the earth. It's a sign of his desperation to feel vindicated for their deaths one way or another. I really love that moment because you can see him fall apart. Once he is struck down by Conan, his followers are in shock, but immediately leave to go back to their homes. And I think at that point, his spell over them had been broken. And that is something that after watching this movie several times, I picked up on. Needless to say, I think Thulsa Doom was an incredible character surrounded in a shroud of mystery and fear. He really is one of my favorite all-time villains because he's realistically scary. What's scarier than a leader who can make a person go against their own family and trust in that leader enough to do anything they ask, even if it means losing their life for it? This was the same warning that was presented in the book Dune, where men followed Paul Atreides into a holy war. It happens constantly, whether on a big plane or in small groups. If you were caught up yourself into a cult, you probably wouldn't even know that you were. That's the other scary part of it. This is such an excellent challenge for our protagonist, who technically still might be alive at the end of the movie because his skull is immortal. Love Thulsa Doom. Absolutely incredible. Now the empathy. For me, the empathy for Conan as a protagonist is incredible. The accurate story of Conan is nowhere near as tragic. He was born on the battlefield and the son of a blacksmith, becoming a respected warrior at 15 and voluntarily leaving home to become a thief, outlaw, mercenary, pirate, and eventually a king by his own hand. The story and character development of Conan in this film was changed and taken from Kull the Conqueror's storyline to insert more drama into the story. And I love it. Yes, it fundamentally changes Conan's character from what it is in the books, but this Conan could be an ancestor. It can still work together. Conan is a Cimmerian, which is a group of people that, according to the ancient Greeks, were nomadic Indo-Europeans who existed about 1000 BC, with little to no record of their existence remaining. However, this may be the very reason that Howard chose to write about them, because where he lived, there were really not a lot of access to history and research. So he made up their culture and the Hyborian age in which they lived. In the story, the Hyborian Age, Howard describes it as having a rich culture with influences of Celtic and Norse with strong links to Atlantis. We don't get to spend much time in Conan's village, but we do get to hear some important teachings from his father about what's important in life. This is where his father teaches him about their god, Crom, and introduces him to the riddle of steel in an epic monologue. Fire and wind come from the sky, from the gods of the sky, but Crom is your god. Crom, and he lives in the earth. Once giants lived in the earth, Conan, and in the darkness of chaos, they fooled Crom, and they took from him the enigma of steel. Crom was angered, and the earth shook. Fire and wind struck down these giants, and they threw their bodies into the waters. But in their rage, the gods forgot the secret of steel and left it on the battlefield. We who found it are just men, not gods, not giants, just men. The secret of steel has always carried with it a mystery. You must learn its riddle, Conan. You must learn its discipline. For no one in this world can you trust. Not men, not women, not beasts. He points to the sword and he says, this you can trust. Now, one of the things that we experience in the opening of the film is the fashioning of a sword. You get the feeling that this is the kind of sword that might have been given to Conan when he becomes a man. It is a family affair, with his father forging and his mother binding the leather on the handle as little Conan watches. It seems like a simple moment with little to no dialogue, but it sets up the importance of the sword and its relationship to Conan. Conan's father loses the sword and is killed savagely by dogs in the Vanir raid, and his mother is killed by the very same sword that she helped to create. There is a visually arresting moment in this gruesome scene where Conan can't believe what is happening as he stares at his hand, which his mother once held, and now it's empty. He realizes that he is truly alone and everything that he had is now gone, and all he has is his hand. Then Conan watched helplessly as Thulsa Doom gave his father's sword to Rexor, who was happy to have his blood-drenched prize. And now, if that's not enough, all of the children of the village were taken to be enslaved at the Wheel of Pain, to die or to be sold. Conan is there for what seems to be possibly 20 years, building his body into a Hulk and tempering his anger. And this is what gives Conan his motivation throughout the film. He is bought and forced into gladiatorial fighting when Conan learns that he's actually a good survivalist, fighting with his raw anger. The more he wins battles, the more his slave master gives him an education in weapons training, poetry, and philosophy. This is technically his upbringing because he is still underdeveloped mentally and indoctrined into a way of life of extreme violence and a lack of tenderness. When asked what is best in life, he says, to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. He's retorting something that was taught to him by his teachers and his slave master. But this is actually a reference to the warlord Genghis Khan, who once said something to the effect of, the greatest pleasure is to vanquish your enemies and chase them before you, rob them of their wealth, and see those dear to them bathe in tears, to ride their horses, and to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. These were truly savage times. The gladiatory days are important because they are the formative years of his development. Through each victory, you can see the scared boy turn into a very confident man. And it even seems that he even enjoys the limelight of the crowd, showing some style and panache to his salute to them at the end of each fight, with arms outstretched and then folded across his body with his weapons of doom at hand. And this is his way of taking a bow for his bloodthirsty audience. And there's also an important moment when Conan is training alone with a sword, and we get a glimmer of happiness on his face for once. He loves the sword and the possibility because it reminds him of home. He also perhaps is thinking that he has learned the riddle of steel that his father spoke of. And you can see his eyes light up, dreaming of what he could do with that sword. It's moments like these that seem fleeting. But we're learning more about what's going on in Conan's mind since he speaks so very little. Out of sympathy, love, guilt, who knows, Conan's slave master releases him into freedom, right into the path of wild wolves that chases him into an Atlantean tomb where he took the sword from a rotting corpse of a giant king. And these were the giants that his father spoke of. Finally, Conan has a sword of his own. He kills the wolves chasing him as his first act of revenge for the dogs that killed his father. And all of this leads him to a she-wolf, which I've always imagined that she arranged for the wolves to lead Conan to her. And as a gift, she had a chained man nearby for them to eat. Again, it's not explained, but this is part of my theory as everything is done visually with very little language, so you piece all of these parts together. And I love that about this film. The interpretation is key. Now, as a witch eating a man who would be king at his own hand would give her more strength and keep her youth and beauty. After Conan dispatches of the witch, he meets his first friend, Subutai, who is a thief and an archer. The two become friends almost instantly, and Conan adopts the lifestyle of a thief in the city of Zamora. They meet Valeria, queen of thieves, on their mission, and the three decide to join forces and rob the Temple of the Snake. The mission was not without its mishaps, with Conan accidentally waking up the giant snake used to guard the gemstone called the Eye of the Serpent, thus having to kill that sacred snake and gaining the personal attention of Thulsa Doom. This is the pet snake I spoke of before that requires Thulsa to have an orgy and the cannibalistic ritual to please his god again. This is another example where it isn't explained, but you can see how this is completely possible. The dots do connect to fill out more detail as the film does set this up for you. Now, Conan finds romantic love for the first time with Valeria, an damsel in distress, who is excellent with the sword, confident, with a love of jewels, and a great catchphrase. Do you want to live forever? I love that she isn't noble or self-righteous, which is often a mistake when writing good characters. She's realistic. Although she has a tough exterior, she seeks riches and is plagued with a deep longing to be in a loving relationship. The relationship between Conan and Valeria comes as a surprise in the film, but happens very naturally. Knowing how Valeria lusts after gems, Conan gives her his prize, the prize that he risked his life for, the Eye of the Serpent. From that act alone, she knows that he really, really likes her, and that opens the door to something more. It's all unspoken and done visually, matching the tone of the film wonderfully. For the first time, both of them have met someone that they can share all manner of things with. Battles, stories, trauma, and pain. There's a moment in a montage where Valeria stares compassionately into Conan's eyes and rises up and then caresses him. You could almost imagine that he has just shared his story of his traumatic loss, and she is comforting him at this moment. It is a brilliant scene. And yet, with his newfound friends, Conan cannot forget his father's warning about not trusting others over the sword. He decides to go after Thulsa Doom alone, and unfortunately, he's caught immediately. He is confronted by Thulsa Doom, finally. The megalomaniac explains his answer to the riddle of steel, which actually he doesn't know. He has never been able to find it. He says, "There is no power in steel, but true power comes from controlling flesh." He didn't have the riddle of steel, but he was on the right track when he said, "What is steel compared to the hand that wields it?" Wow! Those were powerful words that stayed with the audience, but also stayed with Conan because he never forgets this. After being crucified on the tree of woe to die and being brought back to life by his loyal friends, he is resurrected but still seeking vengeance. But now he knows the riddle of steel. It is his will. That is the answer to the riddle of steel. He stares at his hands as he did once long ago as a child. He has the willpower that he can accomplish anything with. In order to bring Conan back from the dead, Valeria had to fight demons, and this is how much she loves Conan. The wizard who befriends Conan, and who is also the narrator of the tale, even warns her that the gods extract a heavy toll to bring Conan back, and she said she would pay them. And sure enough, Valeria pays the toll with her life as a victim of one of Thulsa Doom's vicious snake arrows. I think this is another reason why I adore the story, because like the original Star Wars movie in 1977, there are big stakes in the film where not all of the characters get to live through the tale. It only works if the character is not a pathetic victim. Valeria knows the risks and is willing to take it for love. Obi-Wan Kenobi sacrifices himself to be able to inspire and teach Luke. We're getting a story writing lesson right here in this movie. Another motif for Valeria is that she refers to love and relationships as warmth. So when she dies, she says she feels cold and asks Conan to keep her warm. I've always considered that to be the love between them, and that she was asking him if he could keep their love alive. And at her funeral rites, the wizard says nothing burns at the top of the stone mounds, and yet easily her pyre burned, representing the love between Valeria and Conan. There's a lot of heat where there are sparks and mini explosions that burn so brightly throughout the night. What a fantastic symbolism for their love. I can't speak of how much I just love that scene so much, and how much it means to me to see that, and that they took the care to put that into the story. And it seems like nothing. When you see this movie for the first time, you're like, okay, that's interesting. Okay, what's this little detail? It all means something. Another reason for the fire was that the wizard says that the spirits and the gods were watching this place. So it could also be interpreted that the spirits that dwell there allowed the fire because she had shown valor in her lifetime when she fought off the demons threatening to take Conan. At the big battle between Thulsa's militia against Conan, Sabotai and the wizard, Conan shows off his intellect by using the ancient mounds as a battleground full of booby traps that help pick off the aggressors one by one until there was only 3 who Conan needed to face in order to get his revenge. First, Thorgrim, who never said a word throughout the film, dies easily in a gruesome trap. It's horrible. Then Rexor, who looks to be devastated by the loss, goes toe-to-toe with Conan with his father's sword in hand. Like, can you believe the nerve of this guy? Rexor really is a fantastic fighter and actually gets the better of Conan. But his life was spared by Valeria's ghost, who is dressed as a Valkyrie. This all calls back to the time when she announces that their bonds are so strong that she would come back from the dead to save his life for a second time. There are lots of wonderful setups and payoffs throughout the story, and I'm here for it. After getting a second chance at Rexor, Conan is successful, and either by purpose or by accident, he breaks his father's sword that his opponent is holding. I saw this as an act of defiance against his father's advice and deciding to pave his own way. Before the battle, Conan prayed to Crom for vengeance and says if he doesn't listen, then to hell with him. And again, Conan is determined to be his own master and proves that he has learned the riddle of steel. After winning the fight against Rexor, he holds up his father's sword and the Atlantean sword as he did during his old-fashioned gladiatorial days. He is taking a bow before the gods and spirits who he was told were watching. So he still respects the gods, but he also is ruled by his own will. Love that. And to close out the final confrontation with Thulsa Doom, Conan uses his father's sword to strike him, and once the ordeal is over, he drops his father's sword as if to finally end his thirst for vengeance, to find his own destiny in the world. Again, it's all done as if to be a grand performance to show before Crom. I just love it. Sorry if I'm praising this so much, but I think it's just incredibly wonderful storytelling. Now, the technical aspects. Yugoslavia was the original location for the film, but due to the political instability at the time, production was moved to Spain, utilizing deserts, beaches, and mountains. Roman and Moorish buildings helped to set the scenes. Production designer Ron Cobb, who previously worked on Alien in 1979, took inspiration from the Dark Ages, the Vikings, and the Mongols to define a look of the Hyborian Age. There was a limited amount of sets built due to the budget, which is startling to me because this film has some of the most authentic looking fantasy sets of its time. There's gorgeous stuff here with so much detail, filling the storyline of this make-believe age, and I loved it. There were quite a few miniatures used to play on the perspective and to create the illusion of background landscapes instead of matte paintings. And honestly, I can't tell where because it all looks so realistic. The big set piece was Thulsa Doom's temple, the temple of Set that was built into the mountains of various woods, lacquers, and tons of concrete on a stairway of 120 steps. At the end of the film, Conan was supposed to actually throw a lantern into the palace's central window balcony, but Arnold Schwarzenegger missed his mark, which, by the way, was a long way to have to throw something. So, because it couldn't be redone, the set had to proceed to burn to the ground as intended. The mounds, as they were referred to by production, resemble Stonehenge and was specifically created for the film using styrofoam pieces with a fiberglass exterior to look like stone. You can see how much work it took to make all of these sets and set pieces look real and grounded to the Hyborian age. The detail is incredible. Thulsa Doom's iconic transformation into a giant snake was incredibly jaw-dropping. The illusion was achieved by editing the transformation in stages. At first we see serpent eye contacts, and then the fake head of Thulsa Doom animated to stretch, and then a real snake was filmed on a miniature set. The giant snake that Conan has to kill was a mechanical 36-foot-long puppet that cost $20,000 and took 10 weeks to build. The Tree of Woe was another feature of great interest in the film, and a highlight. The tree was actually a built structure mounted on a turntable, and Arnold Schwarzenegger had a seat mounted into the tree. Real birds were used on the tree branches, but the one that interacts with Conan is a mechanical one. However, the feathers on the bird was real. There's some contradiction about this because Arnold said in his interviews that the vulture was real, but it was deceased. Nevertheless, Arnold rinsed his mouth out to avoid disease right after he bit it in the scene. And it's another scene showing us Conan's defiance. If you like swords, this movie has two of the most iconically epic swords in movie history. The first is Conan's father's sword, also called the Master Sword, and the blade he finds in the tomb is the Atlantean sword. 4 copies of each sword was made, costing about $10,000 each, and the gorgeous ancient markings on the Master Sword were etched through electrical discharge machining. It reads, "Suffer no guilt, ye who wield this, in the name of Crom." It pretty much gives the wielder permission to kill anyone for any reason, no matter how petty or unjust, in the name of their god. That is pretty savage. It was the age of the barbarians, after all. The film was more of an origin story for our protagonist than it was an all-out action film, but we get a lot of adventure and some extremely brutal moments. However, not a whole lot of exciting fighting scenes compared to what modern audiences are used to in today's age. For me, it was perfectly done and used appropriately to match the pace of the story. I love the fact that the film didn't shy away from the realities of the gore, and a few times you get to see some glimpses of dummies, but you can see the effort being made to portray a realistic result of violence with all of the blood sprays. The fake blood was a concentrated mixture that had to be mixed with water, and in cold weather it was mixed with vodka. The film used squibs on the actors, and they also used blood sacks attached to the swords to achieve the look of slicing and the blood sprays that would occur as an aftermath. Not all, but many of the scenes were quite convincing. We have this warrior that has been hacking up people left and right, and he's covered in blood by the end. That makes sense for this story, and I appreciated that. The brilliant final battle between Thulsa Doom's men was an excellent example of Conan's cunning, and it was inspired by Seven Samurai, released in 1954. Now to the music. The composer Basil Poledouris was hired for Conan before the filming started and worked on the score based on initial storyboards. Later on, John Milius sent Basil Poledouris scenes set to classic music to further illustrate the style and emotional pacing he wanted, so it could play as an opera with little to no dialogue. Basil included several inspirations from his own personal life, including some from his daughter. The emotional riffs of whimsy and grandeur enhances the beauty of the storytelling. The score has been frequently used by other filmmakers as temp tracks to advance trailers and TV spots in other films. The film's opening with bombastic, powerful drums set a tone for the Hyborian Age. The theme for Thulsa Doom had a very supernatural sound with a choir singing in Latin. What an incredible score that is one of the most underrated scores of all time. Now the performances. I enjoyed the performances immensely, even though there are a mixture of acting proficiency in the film. We have incredible greats along with acting novices, but the skill of the direction and editing makes it all work together beautifully. Arnold Schwarzenegger, for instance, is great as Conan. Besides the Terminator, some say this was the role that he was born to play. In an interview with Fortune magazine in 2004, Schwarzenegger told them, "My hair was pulled. I was hit with belts. So was the kid next door. It was just the way it was. Many of the children I've seen were broken by their parents," which was the German-Austrian mentality. They didn't want to create an individual. It was all about conforming. I was the one who did not conform and whose will could not be broken. Therefore, I became a rebel. Every time I got hit, every time someone said, "You can't do this," I said, "This is not going to be for much longer because I am going to move out of here. I want to be rich and I want to be somebody." I was going to try to do it in Arnold's accent, but I would probably blunder it. But those are his words, and I love how honest he is when he talks about his ambition. He started lifting weights at 15. He started competing professionally at 17. He won his first Mr. Universe title at age 20, won the Mr. Olympia title 7 times, including the last time for which he came out of a 5-year retirement at the age of 33. He had a few acting credits with movies such as Hercules in New York, released in 1970, Pumping Iron in 1977, and The Comeback in 1980. He worked so very hard to take advantage of his opportunity to be a star by totally surrendering to what was needed to address every criticism. His Austrian accent was the biggest issue, and although he didn't get rid of it, his language was pretty clear. He also had to read the Conan comics and fantasy novels to learn the period dialogue. He was also considered to be too bulky in the pictorials to make certain moves with his sword, so he was asked to slim down, and he did. He had weapons, martial arts, and horseback riding training. He learned extreme climbing, falling, rolling, and jumping. At one point, he had to jump from 15 feet in the air. He even learned how to sleep and live outdoors. On the set, the shoot was extremely dangerous for the cast and crew. One of the main reasons for that was the fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sandal Bergman, who played Valeria, had to perform their own stunts because they couldn't find stunt doubles to match their body types. The scene where Conan is running from wolves was from real terror because the dogs that were used for the shoot were so uncontrollable and wild that they attacked their own trainer. One of the dogs accidentally provoked Arnold to fall down on the rock he was climbing and seriously injured his back as a result. He sustained injuries while being thrown into the fountain at Thulsa Doom's temple, and he also got badly sunburned while shooting the scenes hanging on the Tree of Woe. This was how badly he wanted his success, and all of that dedication is on screen. I think naturally Arnold has a charisma in front of the camera that shines in every role that he's in. The filmmakers made the decision to have all of Conan's enemies be bigger than Arnold Schwarzenegger, which isn't easy because he is actually 6'2". Sean Connery was also 6'2" and a former bodybuilder, and he was considered for the role of Thulsa Doom. I'm not sure what happened there or if they ever approached him, but I can see why they would consider it. He had a wonderful booming voice that would be perfect. Even though there were scheduling conflicts, the filmmaker wanted film, theater, and television actor James Earl Jones, who was 6'2", ready to go toe-to-toe with Conan. At the time, he was doing a Broadway play, Lesson to Aloes. I love it when dramatic actors take on roles like this, and he plays it so seriously. He doesn't get hammy with it, but he just has this grand exuberance about him that makes Thulsa Doom larger than life. His look in particular in the film is so intriguing. Accompanied with the wig and the costume, he looks so different than anything he's ever done before or have done since. So there's something special about him appearing in this movie, and that's what he gives to the role. He really elevates the material. There was some physicality to him as well. He had to learn how to ride a horse, and he had a workout regimen to keep him in shape. Arnold helped James with some of that, and in turn, he coached Arnold with some of his acting, and so did Max von Sydow, who plays King Osric. Max was also amazing as a cameo in the film and delivers some of the best lines in the movie, like a boss. Max said that he took the role because his son was a lifelong Conan fan. John Milius was looking for someone tall that resembled a Valkyrie for the role of Valeria. His search led him to 5'10" professional dancer Sandel Bergman when Bob Fosse recommended her. Bob worked with her in the movie All That Jazz, released in 1979, and she had just finished working as a dancer in Xanadu in 1980 as Muse Number 1. One of my favorite movies. She is not a dramatic actress, but I thought her work in this was timed just perfectly. I think she was also born to play this role because I can't think of anyone else doing it as well. She trained for the role similarly to Arnold and even had one of her index fingers severed in one of the scenes where an extra replaced a stunt person and made a mistake. She was able to have it reattached, so you can't even really tell that that happened, but I'm sure it must have been horrible, and that gives you an example of how dangerous it was on set. Arnold was originally supposed to narrate the film, but executives thought that someone else should do it. Accomplished actor Mako, who plays the wizard, was asked to do it, and there's so much gravity that he brings to the words, making it feel ancient and full of wonder. He is amazing in this, being able to flip between dramatic and comedic portrayals of his character with a dynamic charm. Thulsa Doom's henchmen were played by 6'5" bodybuilder Sven Ole Thorsen, who played Thorgrim, and 6'8" former American football player Ben Davidson, who played Rexor. Sven Ole Thorsen was recommended by Arnold and appeared in a total of 15 films starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, either as an actor or as a stuntman. The enjoyment. There were two endings shot. The American version is the one that I have and the one that I prefer because, nostalgia reasons, which shows Conan setting the temple on fire. The alternative ending was the international cut, featuring Princess Jasmina leading Conan to Thulsa Doom and carries her off somewhere, I suppose back to her father. So depending on what version you saw, you got a different idea of who Conan was even after this whole ordeal. And in my opinion, the scenes with Jasmina are reminiscent of the source material version of Conan. But having just lost Valeria, the American version I think really feels more appropriate. Now, one big problem was the violence, and it started with the studio. It was originally supposed to be a holiday release in 1981, and after the president of Universal saw it, he pulled it out. John Milius was asked to tone down the violence of certain scenes, like Conan chopping off a pickpocketer's arms, close-up scenes on the decapitated heads, and a host of other scenes that were very, very violent. There was still a lot of violence that was left in the film that split critics and audiences alike. But big fans of Conan thought that there wasn't enough violence. However, that didn't stop the film from being a huge success, with people lined up around the block in 16 cities for up to 8 hours to see the film. I remember seeing Conan the Barbarian in theaters, and at the first time watching it, I really enjoyed it. It was a bit violent for me because I was only 12, but it really got me hooked on the character and other things that I got along with the trip at the theater, like I got this Marvel Illustrated version of the film and a Cinema Fantastique magazine that featured the behind the scenes of the film. And both of them are well loved to the point that the covers have ripped and they are super fragile now, but I always love revisiting them. The film finishes with a scene of a bearded older Conan with a crown sitting on the throne of Enqualonia. There is a tease that the story of Conan becoming a king will eventually be told someday. The film was going to be the first of an intended 4 or 5-part series of movie sequels, with Arnold Schwarzenegger committed to star in all of them. As well, his contract restricted him from starring in other sword and sorcery films. The film's direct sequel was Conan the Destroyer, released in 1984, with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mako reprising their roles. I saw this in the theater too. For many years, my mom and I just loved popping it in the VCR, and I will definitely be reviewing that one too. This movie was geared for a wider audience with a lot less violence and sexual references. There was also a big emphasis on comedy, but it still had a good story. At the end of the film, it teased Conan the Conqueror, and it was to be released in 1987. In the meantime, Arnold did Red Sonja in 1985 and Raw Deal in 1986 with Dino De Laurentiis, and his contract was up. By then, Arnold was a hot ticket in Hollywood and his contract expired. A script for Conan the Conqueror was written, but since Arnold was not happy with it, the studio went ahead with the movie but changed it to Kull the Conqueror, released in 1997, starring Kevin Sorbo. Hollywood was like, what about Conan the Barbarian? We haven't done anything with Conan the Barbarian, so they did a hard reboot of the film in 2011, starring Jason Momoa. It was a mixture of Robert Howard's version of Conan and the 1982 movie, but left out a lot of deep psychological, philosophical undertones, and it's a straight-up action movie with quite a few cheesy moments, to be quite honest with you. After a long, illustrious career as an actor and serving as the 38th governor of California between 2003 and 2011, by 2012, Universal Pictures announced Arnold Schwarzenegger's return to the role of Conan for the film Legend of Conan, a direct sequel to the original film, dismissing the existence of Conan the Destroyer and the 2011 remake. However, in April of 2017, it was dropped by the studio. The rights are currently in the hands of Frederick Malmberg, who may be working on a series there is a way to insert Arnold into a project while rebooting it, which is to have him give up his throne for a noble cause, and his grandson, who is named after him, can be the center of the story. It would be nice to have Arnold in it, but you don't have to. But I think that really showcasing Conan as a great mind is so important. Conan is not just a big dumb brute with a sword, and I think you get that with Conan the Barbarian, released in 1982. It starts with an adaptation of a quote from Fred Nietzsche: "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," and this describes Conan's mental and physical journey in the film. He grows from a helpless child to a man who commands his own destiny and won't be a victim of destiny or rules from anyone. He learns the riddle of steel and how to be his own man. In my opinion, this is an underrated masterpiece. My rating is a 9.2. Well, that sums up my review. I hope you liked it, and if you did, I've got over 100 of these videos, so go on and browse my channel to see more reviews from me just like this. Subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the bell icon to be the very first to be notified of my next video. I want to take this moment to recognize my amazing, wonderful, incredibly awesome Patreon supporters who are responsible for helping me to produce this video. Many thanks to these incredible movie lovers for their support. And you too can be on this list by heading over to Patreon and getting a bit of behind the scenes stuff from me that you don't get on YouTube. This is Retro Nerd Girl signing off. Take care, movie lovers, and off to my next review!